Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you to today's lecture at the Käte Hamburger Center of Advanced Study Laws Culture. First, I would like to say that Professor Gebhardt is very sorry that he cannot be with us today. Due to his imminent departure to the conference in Tunis tomorrow morning, he has an urgent obligation today. But he has asked me to chair this session, and I'm very happy to do so. It is with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Morag Grant. Professor Grant will give a talk on the topic of music, conflict, and human rights. Now, first of all, I would like to introduce to you Morag Grant. She was born in Lanarkshire, Scotland. I do hope that I pronounced this correctly. And she studied music and musicology in Glasgow, London, and Berlin. She received her doctorate from King's College in London in 1999 for her dissertation on European serial music in the 1950s. In 2005, she was awarded a prestigious grant by the German Research Foundation to pursue research on a comprehensive cultural history of a famous Scots song, Auld Lang Syne. From 2008 until 2014, she was junior professor of social musicology at the University of Göttingen. At the same time, she was there leading the research group Music, Conflict, and the State, which explored the use of music to promote, facilitate, and accompany violent responses to conflict. Dr. Grant has previously taught at the Humboldt University and at the European College of Liberal Arts in Berlin. Her main research areas are music and violence, and in particular in war, in genocide, and in the context of torture, theory and aesthetics of new and experimental music, social functions of songs and singing, music and human rights, and music in Scotland. Since November 2014, Morag Grant is a fellow at our center. She has published extensively in the areas of her research, and I would just like to mention a few of her publications, of a very long list of publications, starting with the publication of her dissertation, Serial Music, Serial Aesthetics, Compositional Theory in Post-War Europe, which was first published by Cambridge University Press and then very rare for an academic volume in a paperback edition later on. And her more recent works like Music and Human Rights in the Sage Handbook of Human Rights, or Torture in the Journal of Torture and Rehabilitation and Prevention of Torture. And we're waiting for her monograph on Auld Lang Syne, the song and its culture, which is forthcoming. But she has not only published, but has given a number of radio interviews, for example, on music and violence. And I can recommend to not only read her publications, but also to listen to her interviews if you have some time. But today we will have the chance to listen to her personally. She is working on a research project here as a fellow on the topic of music, conflict, and human rights, which is precisely the title of her topic for today. We're very much looking forward to listening to you, Morag.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nina, for this introduction. It's customary on these occasions to extend a very big thank you to Professor Gebhardt and indeed all of the directors and the board of the Centre for the invitation to work here as a fellow. I see no reason at all to break with this tradition. Without going into details, I can see that this year here I'm now in month 3 or 4 of an 11-month stay, has absolutely been an amazing opportunity at exactly the right time in my life and for my work. So I'm very, very grateful indeed for this opportunity. I'm going to be speaking for, I hope, about an hour, hopefully less, with some video clips as well. As Nina mentioned, I come from Scotland. I speak a language that I think is English. You might not agree with this. But what I try to do, I will try and speak quite slowly, and I've also got quite a few slides with the main points of what I'm saying, so that hopefully, even if you're not used to Scottish language, you will still be able to understand what I'm talking about. And what I want to start with today is a piece of cheesecake. And I want to ask if anybody maybe knows, which would be possible, why I'm starting a talk on this topic, or on a musical topic, with a piece of cheesecake. Nobody seems to know. You might have known, it would have been possible. Steven Pinker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, How the Mind Works, famously described music as being basically auditory cheesecake. What did he mean by that? Well, what he was doing was drawing an analogy to the theory of adaptation that we know from evolutionary science, and suggesting that this might be a way to try and understand why humans have developed in such a way that we enjoy something that we call music. And so this analogy goes that just like our taste for sugar and for fat, so the primary ingredients of cheesecake, developed at a time before 24-hour supermarkets and Dunnerläden, when it was very beneficial to us to find high-calorie, high-energy sources of food. So Pinker suggests the pleasure that we get in listening to music might derive from some advantages that related cognitive processes might have given us in the earliest phases of the human species. But of course the analogy is also implying that this is all that music is, something that gives us pleasure, but ultimately in modern life is ultimately without any real use apart from that. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that some musicologists have taken exception to Pinker's remarks and have even presented some countering theories of their own. In one case, even going so far as to ask, quite on the contrary, is music the most important thing we ever did? This question forms the title of an article by Ian Cross. He's the director of the Centre for Music and Science Research at the University of Cambridge, and he's published extensively on cognitive and evolutionary approaches to understanding the meaning and function of musical communication in human social life. And because Ian Cross is interested in music as something that's implicitly social, he takes a very different approach to this topic than Pinker and some other evolutionary scientists. And in this article in particular, Cross criticises Pinker and some others for a number of problems in the approaches that they take to music in their theories. And in the case of Pinker in particular, he notes that Pinker falls into a trap which is all too common when we talk about music, namely ethnocentrism. As Cross puts it, Pinker views music as, quote, an oral commodity to be consumed, disposable on demand. And he notes that this is an idea of music that really only started to take hold in the last 300 years or so. Pinker views music essentially, first of all, as a luxury item, and secondly, one which is primarily or only about what we hear. It's auditory cheesecake. It's not dancing cheesecake, it's auditory cheesecake. Cross then goes on to use a number of perspectives from ethnomusicological research into the different ways that music is used across the world. And he also particularly goes into developmental psychology and looks at the ways that even nowadays children learn to communicate and learn to negotiate the social world. And from this he derives an idea that what he calls proto-musical behaviours are important, not least for the way that they involve several different domains in our brain simultaneously and are also implicitly connected to action and movement. And basically what he's saying is that because musical activity actually involves so many different areas of the brain, proto-musical behaviours might have actually pushed human evolution forward specifically by allowing the kinds of interactions between different parts of our brain which are so important for us in developing our learning and developing our culture. Now, I don't want to go into the finer details of this particular article by Cross, which is highly technical, but I do want to highlight some of his other ideas on the role of music in human social life, not least because, in stark contrast to Pinker, Cross implies that many of the reasons why musical behaviour might have been so important to us in the past still apply today. So in Cross's work, the focus shifts from music as a thing, so as an aesthetic work of art, if you like, to music as an activity, or rather to music as one of several activities that are used in particular situations. And the question that then arises is when and to what ends we use this very particular type of communication, namely musical communication, and what it is about this form of communication that can't be achieved to the same extent by spoken or written language. So when do humans use music? Cross and his colleagues have suggested, for example, that human beings in a number of cultures around the world, in the past and in the present, very often use music in what he calls situations of social uncertainty. So these can be things like marking life cycle transitions, such as birth, adulthood, marriage, death. It's used in situations where the integrity or the stability of a community might be threatened. It's used very often to mediate between the human and the natural worlds, in cultures where this mediation is very important and where the natural world is seen as being an interlocutory partner. And many other examples as well, to which I would add one that Cross doesn't mention, but which is very relevant to the centre here, namely the importance of musical communication in several systems of traditional justice and rights management in traditional communities. And Cross and his co-researchers then go on to suggest that two aspects of musical communication might make it particularly useful in these situations of social uncertainty, where regaining some idea of stability and security are especially important. And the interesting thing is that these two aspects of musical communication might actually seem to contradict each other, but it's the combination of them that's so important. First of all, they say music seems to represent an honest signal, and I'll explain that in a minute, but is at the same time polysemic. In other words, it doesn't have a fixed meaning. It can actually carry a lot of meanings simultaneously, or have a lot of meanings interpreted onto it simultaneously. So what's an honest signal? An honest signal in terms of animal communication is one that seems to reveal something about the nature of the animal that's transmitting the signal. So to take a very banal example, a loud noise implies something that's big, possibly something threatening, which is why animals who feel themselves under threat try to make themselves bigger, physically bigger in terms of their physical size, and also by the noises they give out. It could also be, for example, the fact that a fast tempo in a piece of music implies a state of excitement rather than a state of rest, and so on. Now, if you've ever wondered why it is that music seems to affect us so directly on an emotional level, my argument would be it's exactly to do with this, because it has also to do with bypassing all of the more recent parts of our brain and the rational parts of our brain and going straight to the most primeval parts that are to do with being able to make sense of our acoustic environment, so that we know when is it a safe situation, when is it a situation I have to react to in some way, would be my theory. But that's, of course, only one aspect of the story. The other aspect is the polysemic aspect. In other words, music is generally much less specific when it comes to unequivocal meaning or statements than in forms of language, written and spoken language, that don't accompany music. Now, I say it's generally less specific because, as I've just implied, the vast majority of instances of musical communication in human societies also involve language. But I also say it because there are types of linguistic communication as well that can maybe help us understand what Cross and his colleagues mean by polysemic in this way. And I would take the example of good political oratory for this. Now, a good political orator, first and foremost, wants to get votes. They're not really interested in the truth. They don't honestly signal to that extent. They want to get the maximum amount of people on their side, and they know that in order to do that, they have to make what seem like quite specific claims, but these claims also have to be vague enough for different people to interpret different things from them and to be able to project their very own hopes and fears onto these statements. And when we consider other aspects of how good oratory works, rhythmic patterns, tone of voice, gesture, and the careful use of silence, we might also notice that these are also the very, very same building blocks as for musical communication. So to some extent, music and language are poles on a shifting continuum, but nevertheless, what is most typical for each makes them quite different in their impact. So music is not language, language is not music, and it's difficult to say that one develops from another because, as Cross would say and his colleagues would say, they both actually developed to fulfill quite different functions. This leads Cross and Woodruff in this particular article to make an interesting claim as regards the relationship of these two forms of communication to each other. And I quote, they say, "Language organises social action while music organises sociality." And I will come back to this a little bit later on as well at the end of my paper. I would add something else to this though. Although music in some cases might seem less suited to organising social action, it can also be highly important in helping us to interpret a situation. It can, in fact, not just help us interpret the situation, but it can transform the meaning of a situation, and it can also work to transform the people that take part in this situation. And to this extent, music can indeed be linked to social action because it actually creates the kind of situation where this action can arise. Now, just to illustrate how much music can change your interpretation of a particular situation, I've got a couple of video clips here for which I'm going to have to get the lights dimmed probably. One of the clips, at least some of you might know because it went viral on YouTube a couple of years ago, and what I'm going to show you is the original clip from which it was taken. Cute, isn't he? Yeah. Look at what happens though when we edit that down, and particularly when we add very different type of music. I think some of you already know this. Yeah, the infamous dramatic look video. The lights can go back up now. Suddenly the prairie dog is not looking very cute anymore, is he? It's kind of like Return of the Killer Mutant Prairie Dog. Okay, so much for that cute interlude. What does all of this have to do with conflict and with human rights? Well, I'll come back to the human rights aspect in a minute. It should be, by this point, I think, fairly clear what potential there is for a very important connection between music and conflict, and particularly violent conflict. If, as Cross suggests, musical activities and practices seem to play a particularly prominent role in situations of social uncertainty, then there are few situations as critical as the case of violent conflict and war. You know, these are situations which are very literally and very immediately matters of life and death. And given the importance of wars and conflicts, past, present, and in the future to all of our lives, so to our social lives, political, economic, cultural, we shouldn't be surprised that the uses and the functions of music are as multifaceted with regards to war and conflict as indeed they are in any other sphere of our lives. So just let's remind ourselves of some of the ways that musical activities and practices are utilised in the context of conflict and war. They play, for example, a very important part in memorialisation practices. Our knowledge of a lot of historical conflicts and their outcome is often communicated in song, for example, and music also plays a role in ceremonial practices of commemoration as well. Military training, drill songs, for example, music that's used on route marches in order to lighten the load. Military signalling until the First World War was very often done primarily by using brass instruments and drums. The use of music as a tool for emotional management in the field of conflict and war, as in other areas of life, very important both for combatants and non-combatants during and after the conflict, and has very, very many different aspects, only one of which is music therapy in the stricter clinical sense. Then we have religious and spiritual practices, which are very often very prominent in conflict situations, as ways to help make sense of violent encounters, to prepare people to take part in them. And most religious and spiritual practices at some level, in most traditions, will make use of music at some level, and very, very often music plays a very, very prominent part in them. And last but by no means least, of course, we have psychological warfare, using music in many subtle and not so subtle ways, and so on and so forth. The possibilities to some extent are endless, and this is why when I'm talking about music and war, but you could also extend this to other types of violent conflict, I tend to use this model to try and help us begin to sort out all of these different situations and their concomitant musical practices, and hopefully to help us begin to understand a little bit more about their relationship to one another. And I also use this model to draw attention to the fact that depending on where we are physically and temporarily in relation to a conflict, the meaning of musical practices and even the meaning of individual pieces of music can alter quite dramatically. Now, basically what this model is meant to do is to suggest that there are at least 3 basic spheres that we can use to begin categorising music's relationship to war or violent conflict. Music at the moment of violence itself, which is in the centre, music in direct preparation of that violence, or the much larger sphere of music in the reporting of violence. And reporting here doesn't necessarily only mean the literal sense of reporting what has happened. It's also simply a term that I use to emphasise that we're talking here about practices that take place at a temporal and or geographical distance to the violence which has occurred, or the violence that will occur, or might have occurred that we don't really know because we aren't there. Now, one of the most pressing questions that faces us when it comes to the laws of war, but also laws aimed at preventing war and other forms of conflict, and I'm thinking here in the first instance of international human rights law, is the question of how we get from this sphere far away from violence, musical reporting of violence, to the actual violence itself. In other words, how can music be implicated in incitement to violence and or in propaganda for war, and what can we actually do about it? So now a little bit of revision for some of you, and for the rest of you a crash course on this particular aspect of human rights law. I hope that this can be seen at the back as well. Is it clear enough? Yeah, more or less, yeah. Okay, the right to freedom of expression has been in the news a lot recently, regarded by many as one of the cornerstone freedoms for the fulfilment of other human rights. Now, there is a school of thought that kind of says freedom of expression is perhaps the cornerstone human rights. There's also a school of thought that says actually possibly the right to freedom from discrimination is more fundamental. And I'm mentioning this because depending on which of these two approaches you favour, your interpretation of the laws and the stipulations that I'm going to talk about is going to end up being quite different. So full disclosure, I'm in the latter camp. I'm in the freedom from discrimination is more important camp, but so this is going to affect some of the stuff that I say here. So freedom of expression is regarded as one of the cornerstone freedoms for fulfilment of other human rights. And as it's described in most human rights documents, I'm taking the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights here as an example. This right is taken to cover all possible means of expression that we might think of. So artistic expression is in there as well, for example. And it also encompasses the right to freely seek information. At the same time, and this is where the difficulties start, it is not an absolute right. It's not the ban on torture, which is an absolute right. This one is not absolute. In the pact that I'm taking here as an example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it's clearly stated that the exercise of the rights provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carries with it special duties and responsibilities, and therefore might be subject to certain restrictions. And restrictions can be placed on the right to freedom of expression in certain cases only, for reasons that include safeguarding public health or public morals, whatever they are, or to safeguard the rights of others. But there are also some types of expression which, according to international human rights law, must not only be restricted but in fact prohibited in law. And this is the Article 20, so the follow-on article in this particular case, which states that any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law, and also any advocacy of national, racial or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence shall be prohibited by law. Now, as is so often the case with legal texts, this might seem clear enough on paper, but it doesn't look so clear when we start to put it into practice. What we're dealing with here is one of the most contested, misunderstood, and I would argue also misrepresented aspects of international human rights law, as events of the past weeks have sadly made glaringly obvious right again. Now, both the UN Human Rights Council, which oversees states' compliance with the convention that I've just mentioned, and also the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which oversees the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which has a similar article, Article 4, have time and again pointed to states' lack of reporting on what they're doing to fulfil this particular article, or these articles, 20 or 4. And have also complained several times about states' non-compliance with these aspects of the conventions, and particularly the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination has had to see time and again, this isn't an optional extra, this is really, really centrally important to the whole programme of eliminating racial discrimination. Now, one of the many problems that we have here, and this is something that has been subject to an awful lot of discussion, there's been a lot of international expert seminars over the past 10 to 15 years looking again at this article and trying to understand how can we make sure that it's better understood and better applied. One of the problems is the language that's actually used. You know, what exactly is propaganda for war? You know, they kind of forgot to define what they meant by that. What is advocacy? Again, we can take that to be something quite broad or something quite narrow, and even what counts as hatred and hostility. Now, in this topic, specifically hatred and hostility, some recent documents have introduced a definition that comes from the Camden Principles on Freedom of Expression and Equality that were developed by the NGO Article 19. And as the name suggests, Article 19 is an organisation that fights for freedom of expression against censorship, and takes its name, therefore, from the corresponding articles in the, I think also Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well, but certainly the International Pact on Civil and Political Rights. And their definition is as follows: the terms hatred and hostility refer to intense and irrational emotions of opprobrium, enmity and detestation towards the target group. Now, Article 19, like I mentioned, is an organisation focused on ensuring the right to freedom of expression. They don't have a lot of expertise in the field of religious and racial hatred. And I personally have a problem with this definition. The problem that I have is primarily to do with that one word, irrational. Why do I not like the use of that word, irrational? Well, basically two reasons. First of all, parties to a conflict, so people that are experiencing these emotions in the context of a conflict, who do think that another group is a threat to them, might not feel that this is in any way an irrational hatred or an irrational fear that they have. So you're already facing there the question of who gets to decide whether or not this is an irrational fear. And secondly, and on a very related issue, again, who gets to decide what is irrational and what is an irrational fear, what is a rational or irrational emotion? Any cultural or social historian, any sociologist who's worked on the dynamics of oppression and discrimination knows that this pairing of irrational and irrational is one of the standard devices that's always used and has been used over centuries to justify imbalanced power structures. So, you know, if you're a woman, you're not as rational as a man is. You know, if you're a person of African descent, you're not as rational as a white European person. This kind of idea is used again and again and again, and it comes up again and again in conflict situations as well, and we need to be very, very careful of the language that we use here. And this is relevant to discussions both of measures to combat discrimination and hate crime, and also to issues of the restrictions to the right of freedom of expression, and exactly this grey area in between the two. Because the idea of forms of expression and belief that are more or less rational and therefore more or less likely to be protected creeps up time and again here as well. There is, for example, a wonderful essay by the American constitutional law expert Kenneth Karst on the US First Amendment. And though the US First Amendment is generally taken to be the extreme measure of allowing almost absolute freedom of expression, at least that's the theory, Karst notes in this essay, which I think is from 1979, and he's worked it out into a number of longer texts thereafter. What he says is that the problem is that what counts as protected speech under the First Amendment is first and foremost just that, it's speech, right? This is not just true of the American case. We don't talk about hate expression or even hate propaganda. Most of us talk about hate speech. But also he says it's not just any kind of speech. He says that what seems to be the case in the American debate is what he terms the civic debate model of speech. So the kind of image of a group of rational white men sitting around a table having a political discussion about matters. And what he points out is that he uses examples from the civil rights movement, from the feminist movements and the gay liberation movement to demonstrate that for groups who are effectively excluded from full participation in these modes of civic debate, their protest and their expression of necessity takes other forms that don't in the first instance have to do with speech or civic debate. So, for example, they take the form of simply being in a place, Rosa Parks taking that seat on the bus, people occupying a building where they're not supposed to be, or as he says in the case of the gay liberation movement, it can also be the decision to wear certain forms of clothes that very clearly identify the wearer as self-identifying as a gay man or a gay woman. Now, this last example of these visual markers I think is interesting as well for flagging up another related and very fundamental point, which is that for all that we focus in this discussion on freedom of speech versus hate speech, visual markers and visual communication plays a very, very significant role in discrimination, but also and possibly particularly in hate crime. It's the colour of somebody's skin. It's the fact that their facial features reveal that they have Down syndrome, or it's the fact that they are wearing some form of religious clothing that can make someone a target for discrimination and even violence, simply because they are there and visually identifiable as being a member of the targeted group. And there was a report published just last week, which I haven't read yet, which came to the conclusion that Muslim women who wear religious clothing are much more likely to be at the brunt of hate attacks directed at Muslims, simply because they can be most easily identified as being Muslim. So what I'm getting at here is that there is, as Karst suggests, a privileging of certain forms of communication in this debate, and also a division of different forms of communication into more or less rational forms, more or less important forms, or into types of communication which have more or less claim to be taken seriously. So, for example, we've all heard examples of, oh no, can't you take a joke? It wasn't really meant to offend you. The issue of satire, what is satirical and what is the borderline between satire and humour, and actually a form of religious and racial hatred. Cartoons are a big issue here as well, I hardly need to say. And the problem with this is that when we start to categorise different types of communication in this way, and then privilege certain types of communication as being somehow more important, apart from anything else, we're not understanding how propaganda works. This is also something that can be said about looking for very, very clear statements of intent, for example, when it comes to the spreading of religious and racial hatred. I'm doing fairly well for time, so I can maybe just quickly introduce this. This is actually from a case that came before the UN Human Rights Council in the late 1980s or early 1990s. Concerning Holocaust denial laws in the case of France. It's the case of Foresson versus France. Foresson was a professor at a French university until he was lost his job for claiming that the gas chambers were not used to murder Jews during the Holocaust. He brought this case to the UN Human Rights Council. He said, it's my right to freedom of expression, my right to pursue the pursuit of knowledge and truth. The UN Human Rights Council basically decided that the laws in question went too far, but that in his case, actually, they were quite right. And there's a concurring opinion on this, and this is very, very interesting. I'm just going to read it through because I think it's something that really, really gets to the core of the problem here. Eva and Kretzmer, who's written a lot on the subject of freedom of speech and racism, and they say there may be circumstances in which the right of a person to be free from incitement to discrimination on grounds of race, religion or national origins cannot be fully protected by a narrow, explicit law on incitement that falls precisely within the boundaries of Article 20, paragraph 2. This is the case where, in a particular social and historical context, statements that do not meet the strict legal criteria of incitement can be shown to constitute part of a pattern of incitement against a given racial, religious or national group, or where those interested in spreading hostility and hatred adopt sophisticated forms of speech that are not punishable under the law against racial incitement, even though their effect may be as pernicious as explicit incitement, if not more so. And that, if not more so, of course, is really the core of the problem, because if these forms of discrimination and these forms of hatred are actually more dangerous than obvious statements of intent, then what do we do with a law that's basically meant to prevent this happening, but really at the present time, the way it's interpreted isn't in a fit state to do so? So I'm going to come now to a couple of examples of how different legal systems, one international criminal tribunal and also a more local organisation or government has attempted to address this issue. So the issue of what happens when music is implicated in a conflict situation and might also have played a role in spreading hate propaganda or even in inciting to violence and genocide. And the first case is quite a well-known one for good reason. It's the case of Simon Bikindi at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Simon Bikindi was one of the most popular musicians and performers in Rwanda in the period before the 1994 genocide, but he's now gone down in global history as being the first musician to be tried before an international criminal court for the crime of genocide. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda focused on a number of high-profile cases concerning those that were regarded as being the main masterminds behind the genocide. And just to mention one of the most famous cases to be brought before the tribunal, or another famous case, was the so-called media trial, which focused on those responsible for directing the content of radio broadcasts and also print publications that were deemed to have constituted propaganda for genocide. And what's interesting here is that the propaganda masterminds of the Rwandan genocide have in fact been proven to have taken some of their best practice right from the Rice Propaganda Ministerium. So they kind of knew what they were doing. Now, the media trial is relevant here in the case of Bikindi as well, because a lot of the charges against Bikindi concerned the fact that his songs had been played on the radio station RTLM, whose main function, as was proved in court, was to spread anti-Tutsi propaganda, and Bikindi was also one of the financial backers of that radio station. So, back to Bikindi himself. He was charged on several counts of genocide, but found guilty on only one, which did not directly relate to his music. It was found beyond reasonable doubt that he was guilty of direct and public incitement to genocide for a speech that he held while the genocide was underway. Does this mean that the court decided that the songs had not incited to genocide? Well, it's not quite that simple. One of the reasons why he wasn't found guilty on the other charges has to do in part with the remit of this tribunal itself. The tribunal was set up itself solely to deal with crimes specifically related to genocide. So the basic legal text was the Genocide Convention. And it was also limited to crimes committed in the year 1994, which of course is highly problematic when it comes to incitement, because most incitement to genocide tends to have a slightly longer lead period. In the case of Germany, it was 5 to 6 years. In the case of Bikindi, the trial chamber found that Simon Bikindi composed Nanga Abahuto and Benisi Bahinzi, 2 of the 3 songs that were focused on, with the specific intention to disseminate pro-Hutu ideology and anti-Tutsi propaganda, and thus to encourage ethnic hatred. So in the terms of the Pact on Civil and Political Rights, this would be something that should be a crime. However, there is no evidence that Bikindi played any role in these broadcasts or in the dissemination of the 3 alleged songs in 1994. In other words, we can prove that you incited racial hatred, but we can't actually prove that you incited to genocide, which is a different thing in legal terms. Now, the way that the trial against Bikindi was conducted, and particularly the way that the trial chamber judges approached the issue of musical communication, has come in for sort of criticism. My colleague James Parker from Melbourne Law School, that you know as well, Patricia, has written very extensively about this. And I want to focus just on one example of this as it's reflected in the judgment. And I quote, "The chamber notes that several witnesses highlighted the background music of the songs, for example, the accompanying sitar, the mixed Rwandan Congolese rhythm, and the accompanying traditional dance. Many witnesses spoke positively of his music, describing it as captivating, catchy, having good rhythm and melody, and making listeners want to dance. While the chamber does not doubt Bikindi is a talented and popular musician, the chamber is less interested in the score than the lyrics of his compositions. While the defence argued that the principal purpose of a song is usually entertainment based on melody and rhythm and need not even have a message and might even be cheesecake, the chamber finds that, if anything, emphasising the popularity of the songs may have the effect of assisting the prosecution's case regarding their impact." Which is kind of an interesting point. And they actually, when sentencing Bikindi, they took into consideration that he was a celebrity, he was a famous musician, and put a couple of years onto his sentence because of that, because he really had served as an example to other people. Now, what we see the judges doing here is something that we can't really blame them for, as far as I'm concerned, because it's something that's very, very common in general discourse about music. Namely, it's presumed that the lyrics of a song, the words of a song, and the so-called music itself are completely separate entities, and that meaning is conveyed primarily through the lyrics, which is why I'm often asked, but is it really the music that's inciting to violence, or is it just the text? Now, this kind of logic is wrong on very many levels. First of all, as I've already discussed a little bit, it's not that music doesn't communicate, it just happens to be that music communicates in a slightly different way. Moreover, cultural conventions and historical usage can also mean that the meaning of a non-texted musical phrase is very clear to the receiving public. So if a particular tune has always been used to identify, for example, a particular ethnic group or a particular nation, in the case of a national anthem, people might know simply by hearing a particular melody what is implied when that is played. And this, in fact, has been a factor in clandestine communications in conflict situations, for centuries. Many, many examples of this. But also, even thinking about the text itself, a text that is sung is emphatically not the same as a text that is spoken. Song lyrics are structured differently and delivered differently than spoken language, with the single exception of poetic language. The very fact of the musical structure and the musical delivery changes their meaning, including changing the way that we approach them and try to understand their message. And one example of this is the fact that a lot of commentators on the Bikindi case were concerned that he'd been put on trial for his music at all, because they reckoned that musical expression per se was something that should be exempted from legal measures regarding incitement or advocacy of hatred. So that's part of what I mean when I say if you package something slightly differently in a musical form, then the impression that we have of it, the way that we approach it, changes in many, many subtle and unsubtle ways. Having said all that, I think that the judges in Bikindi's case did get it right on some points, not least when they made it quite clear that although they couldn't prove that Bikindi intended the songs to be used to incite genocide, this did not mean that he didn't intend them to incite hatred, discrimination and violence against Tutsis. And also because they didn't find that the songs had no impact on the genocide, quite the opposite in fact. And here I'm just reading from the second part of this quotation here. They said in 1994 in Rwanda, Simon Bikindi's songs, the 3 songs mentioned in the hearing, were indisputably used to fan the flames of ethnic hatred, resentment and fear of the Tutsi. Given Rwanda's oral tradition and the popularity of RTLM at the time, the Chamber finds that these broadcasts of Simon Bikindi's songs had an amplifying effect on the genocide. I like this idea of amplification. I think that's a very, very well chosen word. And a very good way of understanding the potential of musical practices in situations such as these, because we can understand it also in several different ways. Literally making something louder, which is what tends to happen when we make music. Emotionally intensifying or heightening the message, so amplifying the message. But also amplifying in the sense of bringing the message to more people by virtue of the popularity of the medium. And this also not only in the era of recording or broadcasting, it's something that we know from earlier centuries, particularly in the field of popular song as well. So now I want to turn to my second example. This parade is now unlawful. This is going to raise some quite different issues again. And I want to introduce this point again by showing a video clip. So I'm going to need the lights to be dimmed again. And this is from news footage shot by the Irish national broadcaster RTA in 1969, at the very beginning of the period that is now known locally as the Troubles. I've edited the clip just a little bit for reasons of time. And the context of this clip, which will last about 4 minutes, were riots that had happened surrounding the annual parades by members of the Loyalist orders in Northern Ireland. So this is the Protestant, pro-British, pro-Unionist side. A very long-standing tradition in Northern Ireland. And just to remind us, it's a sectarian stroke ethnic conflict. The other side, the other community in this conflict are the Republican Irish, pro-Irish Catholic side of the Northern Irish community. So as I say, the clip is about 4 minutes long, and then I'll discuss it a little bit afterwards. Now there are many, many layers going on in this short clip, which is why I wanted to show it. We see the flags, the uniforms of members of the Orange Orders as expressions of their identity. We see 2 instances of the memorialisation of past battles, which is very central to these Loyalist Orders too. One, the Battle of Bonn of 1689, featuring William of Orange, who defeated the Catholic sympathising James II and VII there. That was the banner that you saw with the guy on the horse. That's the William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne. But we also, at the very end of the clip, see a wreath being laid at a memorial to the dead of World War I. And that's because the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, or from July 1916, is also one that's very important in the Loyalist circles. Ulster soldiers, Ulster Loyalist soldiers, were among the very, very many British men that died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. And this is important and symbolic in this context because this happened only a few months after the Easter uprising in the Irish War of Independence that led to the founding of the Irish Free State. So Loyalists like to kind of play off these two things against each other. You know, we were off there fighting for, against, bad things, and you were, basically having a war at home. And what we also see in this clip is some of the confrontations, particularly stones and bricks thrown at police, and also a policeman throwing a stone back at the protesters, which isn't very professional. But policing is also a big, big factor in the conflict, which is why I've included that little bit there. But what we see most clearly are 2 communities in conflict with each other, each of them which are using musical practices with other practices in expression of this. And musical practices that are very much linked to physical space. Now, given that so many conflicts are over territory, over who has the right to be where, this is of course not at all insignificant. We have on the one hand the marching bands. Different types of marching bands, in fact, here. We have the flute bands, we have the accordion bands, we also have Scottish-style pipes and drums. And these Scottish bands are an expression of ethnic and territorial identity in a different way because it relates to the so-called Ulster Scots. That's descendants of Scottish Presbyterians that were settled in the north of Ireland in the 17th century. And these marches, by their nature, not only move through a physical space, but also dominate it acoustically. What you didn't see in this clip is the so-called blood and thunder types of flute bands, and these are the ones that use the massive, massive Lambeck drum. This is one of the biggest drums you're ever going to see. They're really, really loud, and they do carry over a very, very large space, so even a much, much broader space than actually the area of which the people are marching down. You got a little bit of that idea in this clip with the bagpipes, which again is another very loud instrument that carries an awful far way. But this marcher's occupation of the space, including the audible space, doesn't go uncontested. We also see at one stage the protesters. They're singing not in an organised fashion, but more spontaneously. And one of the songs that they're singing is "We Shall Not Be Moved." Again, an expression of territorial intent. We're not moving, no pasarán. But one that also in this case is interesting because it links this protest movement to the recent civil rights movements in North America, which also used this song. Now, all of this is taking place in 1969, in the very early stages of a civil rights movement that soon gave way to a much more violent conflict and to almost 3 decades of what, as I said, became known locally as the Troubles. From the late 1960s until 1998, which is when the so-called Good Friday Agreement heralded in the peace process, there were an estimated 50,000 casualties of this conflict, including over 3,500 people who died, most of them in Northern Ireland, but also quite a lot on the British mainland. And this, of course, is not to mention the socio-economic and cultural impacts on Northern Irish communities. There was, and therefore still is, a great deal at stake in this peace process, and it's not over yet. We're still in a very tricky, potentially dangerous situation in Northern Ireland, unfortunately. But there's a lot at stake. So if I told you that this peace process is at risk, still at risk of collapse, and has several times in the past been at risk of collapse over disputes concerning exactly what you've just seen, the rights of members of loyalist orders to march down certain streets in the province that are deemed Catholic. If I told you that that was a serious reason that the debates around this issue were risking the entire peace process in Northern Ireland, you might think that either I or the people in Northern Ireland had gone completely mad, but this is exactly what has been happening. Certain loyalists are still insisting that they want to march through areas that are traditionally predominantly Catholic. The local residents are against that, and just like in 1969, every single July, these parades are a flashpoint that very often leads to some kind of confrontation, and in some years actually to riots and to violence. What this also means quite clearly is that there is more resting on these traditions than we might at first think, and this has led to many attempts by the legislature and by researchers working on this issue to find ways to resolve this issue, some of which have ended up making the matters only worse, but you know, it's an ongoing process. Now, the bans are quite central to this whole debate for a couple of reasons. You can see this first of all in some of the decisions that have been made by the so-called Parades Commission, which was a commission that was set up to kind of decide in an objective manner what parades could be allowed to take place when and where and what routes. And on some occasions, a ruling has been laid down by this commission that the loyalist order in question can march through a contested area, but they have to do so in silence. So in one case, for example, the musicians were actually put in a bus, taken around the Catholic area and then unloaded at the other side, and the marchers were allowed to march through and then got their bands back at the other side. The important thing about that, of course, is that it gives the local people the choice not to be aware of the presence to the same extent. Of course, from the point of view of the loyalists, you could see that that defeats the whole purpose of the march. But the bans are important in another way. You'll have noticed in that clip from 1969 how many children were taking part as junior bandsmen and women. And researchers working on this topic and on this culture of the loyalist orders, I should maybe have explained, are something like Masonic lodges. They're kind of networks, male network organisations that have a very long history in Northern Ireland. And like other types of fraternal organisation, they're losing power and relevance in the present day. But the marching bands are still very popular, and they are therefore essential to these parades to make sure that other members of the loyalist community still take part in these parades and still take part, therefore, in these demonstrations of loyalist presence and power. Now, in Northern Ireland as a whole, the peace-building process has included not only the decommissioning of weapons, but also what's been called cultural decommissioning. Challenging the cultural and the symbolic practices which have become part and parcel of how the conflict has been expressed. In many cases, this isn't about getting rid of the practice in question, but trying to understand it and also trying to redefine it for a new era, which is hopefully going to be marked by peace. And in the case of the marching bands, one strategy here is to provide financial support to these bands so that they don't end up being financed by paramilitary organisations. The social focus that the bands form is also being used as a way to deliver training sessions on things like literacy skills and numeracy skills. And I'm mentioning that also because that itself tells us possibly everything we need to know about the socio-economic background of these band members, and the fact that these are young adults or older adults that in many ways are excluded from full participation in society and in the political process because their level of education isn't sufficient. So it's a way to get to them as well. And here I want to introduce a quotation from ethnographic work that was done by Jacqueline Witherow at Queen's University in Belfast. She was also working with the Arts Council in Northern Ireland on these cultural decommissioning projects. And the quotation is from a young guy who was a musician in a marching band, and he's talking about the attraction of playing in this band. And he says, young men join the band because it gives them a sense of identity and security, but it's also very much a social movement. You know, when you spend nearly every Friday and Saturday night out with them at parades, these guys are your best friends. Look, a group of 60 men out playing on a Friday night trying to win trophies is just a group of 60 men out playing on a Friday night trying to win trophies. We are not plotting the downfall of Rome. Thankfully. Now for me, the most important part of this quotation is the part that I've highlighted. The band provides, he says in his own words, a sense of identity and security. It's a way to negotiate the very kinds of social uncertainty that Cross was talking about when he talked about what's so specific about musical forms of communication. And just to draw this to a conclusion now, this is my second last slide, I think. I don't have time to go into this here, but in the research that I've done to date on a different but related issue, which is the use of music immediately before or during combat, so also uses that might come more classically into the definition of incitement. In this research, I've come to the preliminary conclusion that unlike when people talk about inciting soldiers to violence, for example, in a form of war, they tend to have this kind of Neoplatonic idea that the music used is making the men more aggressive so that they go and fight. In actual fact, if you look at these practices, if you look at the type of music that's used, and if you look at people's reactions to them, and also join this up with what we know about, the psychology of warfare, it seems to be, in fact, that music's main function is not to incite the men to more aggression, but to actually overcome their fear, so that they remember what they've been trained to do and actually go and do it, and also to kind of create and recreate a feeling of community. So the community with their fellow soldiers who they have to go and help defend. And that's important because everybody from military strategists to Stanley Milgram and his infamous experiments in the 1960s have shown this to be of prime importance in enabling people to do something that, in fact, we are not very good at doing naturally, namely inflicting violence and suffering on other human beings. And I think that's interesting because I think in both of these cases, both in the case of going from the larger sphere of reporting for violence and also in this more direct sphere, what it seems to be, I would suggest, is that the point of musical activities and practices are primarily to create or recreate a feeling of communality, which has many good points, but in certain situations might also make it easier to carry out violence. And it's not something that laws and incitement really leave us in a very good place to deal with at the present time. In conclusion, I want to cite another Scot. I didn't mention that Ian Cross is also Scottish, which is also one of the reasons that I like him. Another Scot, this one from he lived in the late 17th and early 18th century, And in the early 18th century, he wrote a pamphlet containing this phrase: "I knew a very wise man who believed that if a man were permitted to make all the ballads, he need not care who should make the laws of a nation." I thought this was a nice quotation for this centre. Fletcher was writing at a time when songs were much more central to the communication of news and ideas than they might be in most societies nowadays. He was also writing not long after a period which in England and Ireland under Cromwell had seen very extensive restrictions on musical practice, partly for religious reasons, but also because the role of ballads and balladeers in the political process and in spreading dissent were very, very well known. And this is, incidentally, another area that I'm hoping to look at during my time at the centre. This doesn't, however, make Fletcher's comments any less relevant to us nowadays, I don't think. Particularly not when we bear in mind that our Western view of music in society is only one of many, many types of approach in the contemporary world. Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment aesthetics, including but not limited to music aesthetics, have tried to convince us to some extent that music is, if not auditory cheesecake, then at least something which in its most refined forms can be approached and studied rationally, there's that word again, and scientifically. Something that by analogy perhaps can tell us something about normativity and about law, so the interest that we have in the centre, but which, at least in its purest forms, which is Western European instrumental art music since about 1750, just in case you were wondering what pure music is, and in the purest forms, it takes place at one step at least removed from these other and much more murky fields of human social life. What I hope to have demonstrated, on the contrary, or at least to have suggested, is that music is not only potentially the most important thing we ever did in evolutionary terms, but is still much more important in human societies than we are often led to believe. Language might also have been of central importance in the development of mankind, but it's not the only form of communicative behaviour that we have developed and which ultimately separates us from other animals. And until we understand and give equal weight to these other forms of communication as well, we're going to have a lot of difficulty in understanding the complexities of social life and how human beings interact, and ultimately we might fail in our attempts to regulate it in the interest of the fundamental rights that we formulated for all human beings. Thank you very much for a whole hour of your time.